Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Perfect Prey. I'm glad you're here. My name is Dr. Christine Marie Cocciola, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have a doctorate in clinical social welfare, where I researched coercive control and the impact on both adult and child victims. Most importantly, I am a survivor and a protective parent. Victims and survivors of coercive control are never to blame, but I chose the name Perfect Prey because coercive controllers, who are individuals who apparently have characterologically disordered personalities, do choose who to prey upon. They choose people who tend to be agreeable and conscientious, perhaps loyal to a fault, fixers, optimistic, and empathic. Or these coercive controllers prey upon those who are most vulnerable, including our children. It's part of their plan to gain control. How do we help our children when they're experiencing systematic, unacknowledged child abuse? We need to understand how these coercive controllers, harmful individuals, attempt to exert their power over us and our children. We need to look beyond a trauma-informed lens, but also layer it with a coercive control lens. So let's engage in personal power conversations that will create the protective parts that will derail the coercive controller from his plans. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Perfect Prey and our second episode. I'm so glad you're here. For those of you who have subscribed, thank you so much. Please feel free to leave a review, as it helps get the message out there to others who may benefit from listening. As always, I'm looking for input and ideas on topics, challenges, issues that you would like me to discuss. This podcast is called Perfect Prey because, unfortunately, there are people who are certainly set up to be the perfect prey of a coercive controller, aka a narcissistic abuser. Particularly our children are the perfect prey for the coercively controlling, narcissistically abusive parent. In episode 1, I talked about the overarching concept of coercive control and its origins. Again, intimate terrorism for those who experience being a prisoner of war, except this prison is for many in their own home. The entrapment does not have to be extreme. Like a cult, sometimes the entrapment feels normal or good or seems to add to our life. Even people who belong to certain churches and establishments may actually feel it's good for their life, may actually feel like it contributes, may actually think they're happy. All the while, the coercive controller is attempting to make our world smaller and smaller, stripping away our autonomy, our agency, our voice. Dr. Evan Stark states, it's like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a home. You don't even know it's happening until it's too late. Yet we ask victims and survivors all the time, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave? Well, if the house next door collapsed due to carpenter ants, would we ever ask the owner why they stayed? Everyone, of course, would empathize with this person. Yet the lack of empathy that is literally absent in the experiences of victims and survivors is quite horrifying, to say the least. So beyond that, coercive control is inflicted via various systems. Again, this is where this empathy is lacking. It is in the microsystem with intimate partner abuse. It is in the mesosystem with major agencies and organizations like churches, family court, criminal court, cults. It is certainly inflicted by macro systems. And that would be governments that are not protecting citizens or not looking out for the best interests of victims and survivors. Particularly in this case, our most vulnerable, again, the welfare of our children. I also discussed in episode 1 that I would unpack how coercive controllers inflict their harm. But I've decided to wait on that until episode 3 because I realized we really need to focus on episode 2, this idea of the who, what, how, and why. Who are these people? What are they doing? How do they become people so intentionally willing to harm our most vulnerable? And then why do they abuse? So to be clear, as a licensed therapist, I am not supposed to diagnose someone who I have not seen or met. So I've always been a little reticent in using the word narcissism. And frankly, I do have a hard time sometimes with diagnosis because we have historically stigmatized people with mental health issues. Certainly, we stigmatize women who may have emotionality due to being harmed. I understand that these characterologically disordered individuals, these coercive controllers, certainly may meet the criteria of NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and even, believe it or not, have the traits that align well with the DSM-5 diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. But I'm hesitant because, first of all, we use the word narcissism way too frequently. And as you are aware, there are people who are, let's say, low-level narcissists. The people that most of us listening to this podcast, the people that mostly have experienced this harm, are people who experienced a very high-level person who has characteristics related to narcissism and or borderline. The concern is who created this criteria, and the criteria in the DSM-5, which is our Bible in basically diagnosing people with any kind of mental health issue. People with anxiety, people with depression, someone with schizophrenia or bipolar. The people who created the DSM-5 are people in positions of power. They are people who were in society historically, the people who made many decisions. And the whole purpose of the DSM-5 was to really separate out people who met criteria of being more normal in society versus those who were considered abnormal. For lack of a better word, deviant. Deviant doesn't mean bad, but certainly that's the historical nature of how we began diagnosing people. Labels are important. They are, and they do help us. The problem is, again, who created these labels? It was historically men, people who were doctors, people who had advantages in society, and unfortunately, oftentimes would use these advantageous positions to exert power over others. Hence, my discomfort with diagnoses. However, I know it's helpful. So why is it that I call them people with characterological traits and I see them as beyond narcissists? Because not every narcissist is an abuser. I mean, there are people, again, who are lower level in their behaviors. The people that we're talking about are people who choose to abuse, and their need for power over others is so significant. Their need to hide their shame is so significant that they intentionally harm other human beings. These people may have trauma. They may have grown up in a challenging home environment, and they chose to take those experiences and to not stop the intergenerational trauma, but to continue the intergenerational trauma. That is what they are trying to continue in our own family systems. They're trying to recreate who they are and their experiences, again, to exert power over others. So this is why I have a problem with using the word narcissism, even though I do, but I like, shall I say, I prefer narcissistic abusers. So there's a category there. These people, these coercive controllers, they have beyond a mental health issue. And saying they are mentally ill puts them in the category with others who have mental health issues. That's unfair and harmful to those people, to those of us who have mental health issues. And so I say this certainly goes in the category of bad, or the bad category. This is beyond mental health. This is, some people, I say it sometimes, this is evil. This is willing to harm another human being at all costs. So I call them coercive controllers because that's their behavior. They coerce and control. in an attempt to retain power. And they do this in a variety of ways, overtly and covertly. And they are living among us. They are charlatans, of course, and they have various amounts of power in society. These are people that we rely on to make decisions, including policy changes. These are people that we rely on to protect our children, including child welfare, family court. These are people that we expect to protect us, such as police. These are people who engage in behaviors to exert power over others and do so in a way that creates an imbalance in the power of the people beneath them, the vulnerable. So I don't believe that all narcissists are coercive controllers, but I do believe that all coercive controllers certainly do line up well with character traits of narcissism, of narcissistic abusers. This is not the regular use of the term. This is people who choose to abuse. These people also have some character traits of borderline personality disorder. If we look in the DSM-5, they certainly have a huge fear of abandonment. And they have fractured relationships in their lives. If we look at their history, we can see that retaining relationships that are authentic is really fragmented. So this is not to suggest anyone diagnosed with either of these disorders is harmful, because frankly, if someone is diagnosed with either of these disorders, they are seeking support. They are recognizing that they need to change some of their maladaptive coping mechanisms. However, what we do know is most of these people don't seek support, right? And that there is certainly an intersection of abandonment with significant shame that creates perhaps the perfect storm for harm to occur. These people are not able to have stable relationships. And when the mask is pulled off, we call this the mask. When the curtain has been drawn and people realize that they are not able to retain the relationships that they are faking to have, they truly exert the most extensive type of power and control over others. Harm is the end result that they're looking for. But these are people who also did not receive what every child needs in life. I mean, virtually every child needs to receive unconditional love and the ability to be authentic, to be themselves, to be loved for who they are. Because when children don't have that, they grow up with shame. And in that shame, they don't have a strong attachment to one primary caretaker. To be clear, there are some children who survive these circumstances and end up being absolutely fine. But most often, we know that children need this. So where did these people come from and why does this happen? Well, again, going back to this idea about how I'm not too fond of diagnoses, because most people's challenges in life, their mental health challenges in life, their behavioral challenges in life, in this case, bad behavior in life, is due to trauma, is due to something that was missing somewhere along the way. There's a great Harvard study that details that most of us are born either more ego compromised or ego resilient. What does that mean when I say ego? That's that part of our personality that we're born with. The more adaptability, ability to overcome obstacles is ego resilient. Ego compromised is the child who just has more challenges in that way. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It doesn't make us a bad or a good person. But there's family system circumstances that can enhance that or retract from that. Think about a fulcrum with a seesaw. A fulcrum is basically the stable part of who we are. And we might be born a little bit more, again, ego compromised, so a little bit on the downside of the seesaw, or a little more ego resilient. The way we're born really has nothing to do with us. It's more about genetics, our DNA, and of course, what we now know about epigenetics, right? The trauma that's carried throughout generations, perhaps or certainly could influence it. But then we're born into a family system. And ideally, we're born into a family system that can support us in creating more of that ego resiliency. Let's say that we were born a little more ego compromised. Hopefully, we're born into a family system where we are loved and accepted wholeheartedly, unconditionally. We're able to be our true selves, authentic. Ideally, that's what we hope for all of our children. David Pelzer is a great example of a child that if we look through his lens of ego compromise or ego resiliency, we think perhaps he was born more ego resilient. He wrote the book and its sequels, A Child Called It, horrifyingly abused in the 70s before child welfare actually had mandated reporting. Schools did not report to anyone when a child came to school abused. He was both overtly and covertly harmed by his mother, who scapegoated him. I think she would probably be called a coercive controller now. That's who she was. She had more than one child. David was one of, I believe, 4. And she harmed him significantly. Yet he was able to overcome his circumstances and educate. And he found his voice in this education of others, of his experiences. So I would say that he probably was born more ego resilient. And even though he was born into a harmful situation, he was able to overcome those obstacles. Children who are born more ego compromised are not automatically going to be set up for difficult life challenges. That is not the trajectory. But what we know is if you're born more ego compromised, it's certainly helpful, so helpful to have a family system that is supportive in these really remarkable ways. There's not enough to be said about knowing that you are loved unconditionally, knowing that you are able to be authentically yourself. Gabor Mate talks about this, knowing that no matter what you do, no matter how you behave, you are loved. You are loved implicitly. So clinically speaking, foundational to this healthy development, the children are able to create a strong attachment to at least one primary caretaker, takes primacy. I mean, literally, that is so vital. And again, there are some children who escape this and don't have a strong attachment to a primary caretaker. But I believe this is what's happening with our children. They are having their attachment fractured to that one healthy parent, that one loving parent who loves them unconditionally, but they're being told that parent doesn't love them. In this attachment, this healthy attachment, they feel secure. And in their security, they do not grow up with deep-seated shame, or they are able to process that shame. In that, they grow up to be more resilient. This vulnerability of children who grow up in our family systems, we need to counteract it. We need to support them in overcoming challenges, losses, breakups, whatever it is. These children need to grow up with, all of our children need to grow up with ego resiliency. So, even if they were born ego compromised, they might come into a family system and become much more ego resilient. I know you are all thinking of situations right now, perhaps yourself, where you overcame difficult circumstances in childhood and had or have adaptability, kind of like that, brushing ourselves off and getting up again. Trauma survivors are great at this. But really knowing that this part of our ego that needs to have this resiliency, and if it doesn't have it, it needs to be fostered so that we can overcome challenging circumstances. Again, nothing wrong with being born a little more ego compromised, a little more vulnerable, a little bit less adaptable. There's nothing bad about it. But if I'm born more ego compromised, as perhaps the coercive controller was, and then I grew up in a family where I'm not loved authentically, where I'm not allowed to be who I truly am, where I'm shamed for being me. There's no unconditional love. I'm not able to have a strong attachment to a primary caretaker who loves me in this way. Then I perhaps grow up with this shame superseding my entire life. I have to hide it. And that's the mask that everybody talks about, right? It's all around us. If I were this type of person where I had to hide who I truly was, the conversation might be like this. We become really good actors, really great actors. We do great in our careers. We might look like we have amazing relationships. We might be the beloved guidance counselor, an engineer for NASA, maybe the local plumber, certainly a good teacher. It doesn't matter. I could even be a priest. I mean, there's a variety of different occupations that I could have. We are all charlatans, masking and masquerading behind this false sense of self. Because being who I truly am is something I cannot handle. Don't you understand? There's too much shame. A lot of people that know us think we are amazing and think that we are the salt of the earth, good human beings. And if we are grandiose, well, then we're the life of the party. When the reality is, who we are is someone feeling and living with deep-seated shame. The behavior we're exhibiting is fake. So the difference between you and I, the coercive controller, the narcissistic abuser, is that when I do something wrong, I can't acknowledge it. When I do something wrong, I can never apologize. When I do something wrong, I have to project it onto you. I have to blame you. I darvo you. I deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. I can't take accountability because if I do, then my shame will be exposed. Sometimes I'll apologize, but my apologies are fake. I really don't know how to look into myself and try to change the parts of myself that may not be healthy. You do. You're different than me. And frankly, I like mirroring you. I like being like you. I like to pretend I'm like you. That's why I'm attracted to certain people. That's why you were my perfect prey. So these coercive controllers, narcissistic abusers have grown up in a family system like this. And what they have learned, again, is to hide who they truly are. And when we have a family with them, they are not truly a great parent. They behave like one. They watch us. They watch other people. They might pretend to be interested in the children, or maybe some of them don't get enough fuel or oxygen, some people call it, from the children, and they might be disengaged in some ways. The moment that they stop receiving the fuel from us, their primary scapegoat, is when they turn against us. The moment they realize we're onto them, the moment that they realize we don't authentically love them anymore, they can feel it, and that ignites the shame. It's like burning all the time in an oven, but man, it's like putting gasoline on it. That's the fuel. And when we ignite that shame, they have to do whatever they can to harm us. That's when they turn against us. And as you know, the abuse becomes 100 times worse. We know this. We know in post-separation abuse, which is a form of coercive control, that research shows us that it intensifies in 90% of cases. So I think it's important to highlight that just because, not just, but just because it happens post-separation, that we need to be really clear about the fact that it's been going on all along. Pre-separation, it just maybe wasn't as overt. When the shame is exposed, they have to retaliate. And so now it becomes more overt. But again, it's been going on since day one. I have some moms who tell me things like, but he was really nice in the beginning, or he was so good to my children, but it was all a facade. He's just a fantastic actor. He is so good at it. So knowing that there has been a slow indoctrination of our children and diminishing of us all along the way in some way, often like behind mockery, the lowest form of humor, by the way. So, or often just like in an attempt to sound like they care, like, oh, your mom, she's so tired all the time. Sounds like he cares. Really doesn't. And so, really, this is how they bring in from the very beginning, day one, all of their assets to their case. So, their case is going to be to have the children turned against you, right? So, they're going to make a case that you didn't really love them, that you didn't really care about the children, that you're crazy, that you, of course, financially decimated the family. That didn't just happen post separation. That whole indoctrination of getting their allies in place was going on since the beginning of time. They've been training your children to be soldiers the whole time, so that when the day came that you actually did see them for who they were, they would be ready. And all along, you were probably always trying to do the right thing. You were always trying to accommodate. You were trying to create equilibrium in the home. You'll hear me say this phrase again, but I call it intuition disintegration. We don't gaslight our children because that has malice intent. The abuser is always gaslighting our children. That's not what we're doing. But when we say things like, oh, your dad loves you so much, that is disintegrating their intuition when the person has been abusive, when the child knows there's been tension in the home. So all along, this coercive controller has been harming our children. And then when it comes to a head, the children who are his soldiers oftentimes fall right in line, particularly if they are also ego compromised, particularly if the attachment to you has been fractured consistently and persistently, which for many children it has, but the ego resilient child doesn't really fall in line as readily. So this didn't happen over a month or a year. It's been happening for years and years, which is why it's so important for protective parents to understand they need to be working diligently to ensure that their children are seeing and gaining clarity. It's the gift of perspective. It's discerning for them. It's giving them that ability to discern who is their protective parent. And so a lot of protective parents that I have been working with are dealing with someone who is this 1 out of 10, not a narcissist, but a narcissistic abuser. The need for control is so intense due to the shame that I exert the control at all costs. Their primary goal, to hide their shame. They project it around them everywhere, onto us and onto our children. And sometimes, sadly, they'll do anything for this revenge. We've all heard of horrific cases beyond breaking the law. This is when femicide and filicide occurs, the murder of women and children. We tell victims to leave all the time, yet we know they're most at risk when they do. And so, yes, of course, this can happen to men. Absolutely very painful. But it is like the breast cancer analogy. It happens to women much more. So we focus more on women, and we live in a patriarchal society. There is gendered oppression. Society is set up in a way where women can be oppressed more readily than men. It just is a fact. But of course, men can be harmed. And I would say that this relates to who the coercive controller is. Perhaps once a little boy at 2, 3, and 4 who was not allowed to be vulnerable, to show his true feelings, to be authentic. He learned early on that love was conditional, and this created a great deal of shame for him. Shame he needed to hide. Perhaps born a little more ego compromised. Probably born in a way that he needed to have a real significant amount of love around him, unconditional love, and he didn't get it. He had a harmful parent. So it's really heartbreaking when we think about how easy this is to remedy. It's simple. We need healthy parents, healthy people raising our children. It only needs to be one parent, one caretaker. Children are better served with one healthy parent than one attempting to navigate unhealthy relationship dynamics due to an abuser. Children see this anxiety, they feel the tension, they learn early on to regulate their own behaviors, which does not lead to ego resiliency. This cracked foundation in the household, again, like Evan Stark states, it's like carpenter ants devouring the foundation. We don't even know it's occurring. Protective parents are stripped of their autonomy, their agency, they're regulating their own behavior. Children are watching. Children's intuition is being totally annihilated and disintegrated from their bodies. They don't even know what they should be feeling anymore in their bodies, just like the protective parent has consistently ignored her own body reactions. So we know who they are. We know certainly what they are doing, how they became who they are, and why they do it. Their own shame and trauma, probably born more ego compromised, not receiving authentic love, and not having that ability to attach to a parent who loves them unconditionally. But here is where perfect prey is exemplified. Beyond the coercive controller harming you and stripping away your agency, the coercive controller is an individual who is doing this to our children and actually wants our children to be ego compromised. An ego compromised child will be more readily aligned and ready for battle against the protective parent. An ego compromised child can be easily manipulated, will fall into line with the gaslighting, may even in some ways behave by role modeling the behaviors of the coercive controller. And the coercive controller, again, has been doing this since day one, right under our noses. When we thought they were trying to be a good parent, they actually were insidiously harming our children in very nuanced ways, covertly. I mean, even the most astute of us missed the signs. I was doing clinical work, seeing people in my private practice, and I didn't realize what was going on in my own home. It wasn't until I left that I found out that the indoctrination of my children had started 9 years before. I didn't know it. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong. And I didn't know where it was coming from. I would have never believed in a million years that this person that I was trying really hard to have a good relationship with was actually all along trying to harm my children. It is child abuse. So if the coercive controller can compromise our children in much the way that the coercive controller was compromised as a child, overtly, but also very insidiously and covertly, so nuanced that the signs can be missed and or because protective parents really don't want to believe it's happening, then really knowing that they create this place where our children feel that the protective parent is either unlovable, untrustworthy, doesn't love them, is betraying them. And certainly that foundation of attachment begins to get cracked all along the way. I call it fractured attachment. The coercive controller did not have a strong attachment to a protective parent, and in many ways is working diligently. I say they're working double time to fracture the attachment with the protective parent. And so, being ahead of the coercive controller's game, knowing what his game is, if you can see it, if you're still living with this person, I want you to watch. I want you to look around. I want you to start recognizing the dynamics. If you're listening because you have an inclination that you are being abused, you're looking for validation, then we have to assume that also your children are being abused. This is not an abuse that child welfare agencies or courts notice, or even someone you trust will see it clearly. It is truly more traumatic, though. Research shows us when abuse is hidden, when we can't express it, when others don't see it, that it is more traumatizing to the brain. This is a slow chiseling away of the attachment the child has with you. I want you to be strategizing how to intercede. We are playing a long game here. This is a marathon, not a sprint. We need to strategize being ahead of the coercive controller's game, to see their playbook and know what is coming next. The coercive controller is trying to do to your children what happened to him. That's the goal. Because if he can do that, they will not have agency, autonomy, a voice. And if they don't have agency, they will not have the ability to stand up against him. They will align. So, in episode 3, I do hope to talk about how he inflicts his harm, the overt ways, but also the very nuanced, insidious ways. I truly appreciate you listening, and I hope to see you back here for episode 3. Bye, everyone. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and individuals should seek out appropriate medical or mental health services from a professional if they or anyone else they know is at risk of injury or harm. The views of this podcast and those discussed here are solely those of the podcast author or podcast guests and are not intended to represent anyone else's opinion.